And it's my pleasure to introduce the three panelists over here. So we have in the middle Dr. Shin-Kyu Ryu. I'm sorry. It's okay. That's okay.
Thank you.
And I'm going to highlight some fun stuff on his bio. Dr. Ryu was a principal researcher for Waters 8, which looked at comparative sanitation case studies in Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea. He's been a researcher for the World Bank, including such publications as the Public-Private Partnership Reference Guide 2.0. Who did 1.0? You know? Delivering universal and sustainable water services, partnering with the private sector, guidance note. He has also given speeches at the Asian Development Bank, the Korea Environmental Institute, and something I'm really curious about is that you're going to speak at the World Toilet Association.
Yes.
So in the Q&A I might have a question about that. Dr. Ryu received his PhD from the Sharp School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, his Master of Science from Queen Mary University of London, and both his BA and a MA from the Washington University in St. Louis. Over here we have Professor Louis Thomas. He is here in the anthropology department at Idaho State University. And he has done extensive research in Burma, or Myanmar, since 1996, specifically on the development of tourism in Burma. And then on the far end, we have Dr. Kim Hyek, my lovely colleague in the in the Global Studies Department. He received his MBA and PhD from the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago. He specializes in international business, and he has taught international economy, international management at the Chinese University in Hong Kong, University of Michigan, and Idaho State University. His current research interest is on the role of international organization and economic development. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making time to speak to us. Yes, big clap. So, if you want, you can go from your right to the far left. So, if you want to start, and then we'll leave some room for Q&As at the end. Or you can, however you're comfortable. You need a PowerPoint?
Yeah, I need to just pull it up real quick. I've got it loaded up. Okay, well, thanks to Jillian and for inviting me. I know speech teachers, professors say you're never supposed to do this, but I'm going to qualify things before I begin. I'm filling in and just sort of learned about this Tuesday evening of this week, so I was up till 4 a.m. last night, this morning, kind of trying to put something that I hope might be of some interest to folks together, or they might get something interesting out of. A little bit about my background. As was mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and I've worked in Southeast Asia and the country of Burma, Myanmar, for more than 20 years doing research there, been back and forth about 15 different times. I'm not a foreign policy person at all. Anthropologists tend to sort of work on a grassroots level, on the street level, qualitative research, things like that. But once I started thinking about the topic for the Frank Church Symposium, once I was invited to be here 36 hours ago, I started realizing that there were probably hopefully some interesting things I could say, even though this isn't sort of my field, so to speak, being foreign policy. As was mentioned in the introduction, my primary area of research in Burma, Myanmar, the country has two different names. They're used kind of interchangeably, so I'm just going to go with Burma, okay? Excuse me. So it's this large country here, sort of nestled in between India, China, and Thailand in Southeast Asia. And it has a history of the 20th century and into the 21st century of being a very isolated country. It's often had been characterized as the second most isolated country in the world. And beginning in the 1990s, the government, the military dictatorship began a campaign to try to develop some sort of international tourism industry to bring in badly needed foreign exchange and currency. And so that has been my sort of ongoing, for more than 20 years now, sort of an ongoing research project, along with some other anthropological topics of religion and other things that I won't get into. But when I think about foreign policy and the evolution of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Burma, the thing that comes to mind is sanctions. And Burma's been heavily sanctioned by the U.S. government since 1988, and it's gone through many metamorphoses. And so that's the first thing that pops into my mind, U.S. foreign policy in relationship to Burma, is a whole series of punitive sanctions that the U.S. government has imposed for decades into Burma. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is just give you a brief background of the sort of situation in the country so you can understand why sanctions is what comes to mind when I think of U.S. foreign policy, why the U.S. Imposed a whole series of sanctions on Burma. And again, as an anthropologist, I'm not a policy wonk. What I can share is sort of ordinary people's views ordinary Burmese people's views, whom I've known for 20 years or for briefer periods of time. I've conducted hundreds and hundreds of ethnographic interviews in Burma over the years, and sort of their sort of street level take on U.S. sanctions in their country. Okay. So this is my primary area of research. Is the volume okay? Am I too loud? Okay. I'm not used to speaking into a microphone. I usually just shout to my students. So this is the old ancient capital in the center part of the country. It's right kind of in the center area there, and it's been my primary area of research because it's an ancient capital. It's an amazing historical site, and this attempts tourism in the country. Burma was a British colony for 150 years. It was part of British India, and so it was a colonial possession of England, as you know, were many countries in the world at that period of time. And this is the king of told in 1880. So we had British control, and then after the upheavals of World War II, Burma got independence from England. This is really I'm just rushing through a very abbreviated version of all of this. Okay? so that was that period in history. And then what happened in 1962 was a military dictatorship after a kind of chaotic post-colonial transitional period. A very hardline general took power, the guy on the left there, Win, and he instituted these policies of absolute military control of the government. It was a full-on military government. And also policies of isolationism, taking Burma out of world organizations, closing the borders, sort of nobody comes in, nobody goes out, which was the case for decades after 1962. And that's pretty much how things continued for many decades in the country. Absolute military rulership, all the ministers of the various governmental departments were generals, often, I have to say, rather incompetent, not trained in the particular field that they were a minister of, but had loyalty to the top general. And that was the situation, that has been the situation for decades in Burma. It's a very repressive regime, no rule of law, a lot of, extrajudicial jailings, torture of dissidents. The economy went into rapid decline after 1962. And so it was one of these countries that was way up on like Amnesty International's list of, worst human rights offending countries in the world. In 1988, after decades of this, there was a mass revolt, and hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets protesting this government that did not represent their interests and so forth. This was brutally suppressed, and this is where the U.S. foreign policy angle starts really coming in. Prior to 1988, the U.S. had maintained sort of normal relationships with Burma, financial and otherwise. It was just kind of off the radar screen. 1988, first on the scene, 3,000 protesters were shot by the military in the streets. It was, obviously very brutal, got a lot of international attention, and so in 1988, the U.S. imposed their first sanctions against the Burmese government. The dissident leader of the country was Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. She was put under house arrest. She was the leader of the National League for Democracy, or is the leader of the National League for Democracy, and spent more or less 2 decades under house arrest. So again, all of these things coming together where Burma's now sort of really becoming, the poster child for repressive dictatorship, right? Again, military, very heavy-handed military control, propaganda posts. This is what I wrote my master's thesis on, was propaganda, public propaganda, billboards, the Tatmadaws, the military, and anybody against, you're either with us or against us. Again, lots of human rights abuses for anybody who opposed the regime. And then pictures of the military leading the peoples of Burma to a bright future, and so on and so forth. So in this context, then, the 1990s is when the regime began trying to develop international tourism, because it's a gorgeous country, hundreds of miles of pristine beach lines, historical sites. I mean, it's just a beautiful, beautiful place. They attempted to cash in on it. High-rise hotels started sprouting a little bit in the capital city. This is the capital of Yangon, as foreign investors saw this as a really untapped, international tourism market. Aung San Suu Kyi remained in house arrest. My interest at this point was, again, I was beginning to study tourism, and even though there were sanctions being placed on Burma for a whole variety of things by the United States had not sanctioned travel to Burma at this point, even though people like Colin Powell and others in the early 2000s were saying that the U.S. should prohibit Americans from traveling to Burma because tourist dollars just further support this, this terrible regime. Okay. The dissident leader who was under house arrest, as I mentioned, Aung San Suu Kyi, she also, as the voice of the people, so to speak, she was also advocating for a tourism boycott, that tourists should not come to Burma because your money lines the wallets of the generals. And I, under strange circumstances, this is 1990s, had a chance to meet with her for several hours while she was under house arrest. That's her house there to the left, but she, so I got this straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. She was saying, yes, please communicate to Americans and others, do not come to Burma. Your dollars are just making things worse for us. So that became part of my research, was, okay, so we have this debate about sanctions, U.S. sanctions, about boycotting tourism, etc. But what do people sort of on what do Burmese, ordinary Burmese people feel about this is what I've been investigating. Okay. So meanwhile, military control continued on through the 90s. In 1997, the Clinton administration enacted the toughest sanctions to date, banning all U.S. investment in Burma, financial transactions, really taking the United States out of the Burmese economy as much as possible. Another issue that was vexing the whole situation was the narcotics trade in the mountainous areas of Burma. Very remote areas, you had, in the 1990s, the world's largest opium production area of the entire world at that point. And this was due to ethnic insurgencies. There were a lot of minority groups who were fighting the Burmese military government, armed struggles. They funded themselves through growing opium, selling heroin. And so that was another, sort of thing out there, that here's this country with this terrible military dictatorship, all these human rights abuses, and it's the world's largest supplier of opium, transformed into heroin. So all of these things were coming together. There were armed militia groups in the mountains. They had their own armies, so you had ongoing sort of civil wars, small-scale civil wars. The Burmese regime was seen as being complicit in this opium trade, that they must be profiting from this, multi-billion-dollar opium trade. This was a strange billboard I came across one time in the early 2000s. In a remote area where the top-ranking member of the Burmese government is warmly shaking hands with the world's most wanted drug lord at the time. Because, of course, the regime had been telling the United States and European Union over and over, we have nothing to do with the opium trade, we're uninvolved. And I was like, well, what about this billboard here? But anyway, so by 2005, Condoleezza Rice named Burma one of the 6 outposts of tyranny. So by this point, there were continuing in 2003, the Bush administration even strengthened sanctions further. And so the U.S. was really attempting to economically squeeze the regime in order to, effect regime change, ostensibly. But life sort of continued on. And I think getting back to the U.S. foreign policy, the sanctions I don't think were particularly effective in the country. Burma is a very rich in natural resources country. There were a lot of customers for its natural gas, for its teak forest. 70% of the world's teak forests are in Burma, and so China and neighboring countries. And so anyway, these U.S. sanctions dragged on for years and years and years, getting progressively tougher with no noticeable effect. My angle as an anthropologist, again, is what do ordinary folks think about this? To cut it short, because I know I don't have a whole lot of time here, but the overwhelming view of ordinary Burmese people was, this is a bad thing for us. We've been isolated already for decades. This is further isolating us. The generals and their business cronies are phenomenally wealthy already. They have all the connections with China and everywhere else, and they're going to continue making money, and we're the ones that suffer because we're further isolated, have even less economic opportunities. And there was that same view people had about the tourism, the suggested tourism and travel boycott that was being sort of put out there. The industries that were hurt a bit, I guess I could say, is by the sanctions were the teak industry, because teak had been exported to the U.S. quite a bit before the sanctions. By 2003, basically you couldn't do any business with Burma whatsoever. You couldn't import, you couldn't export. The Bush administration put a very sort of draconian sanction on Burmese rubies, which are the finest rubies in the world. Most gemologists agree. Another great resource. So those industries were hurt somewhat, but basically, as I said, the sanctions did not seem to change much. The regime built an entirely new capital city. at the cost of billions of dollars in the middle of nowhere. So they obviously, we're not doing much of a cash crunch, even though 90% of Burmese people were living sort of, day to day, week to week. Most people I know in Burma are just kind of getting by. But part of the reasons I think sanctions didn't seem to work in terms of U.S. foreign policy with Burma is, for one thing, it's a very rural agricultural country. For the most part, 80% of the people live in small farming villages. A lot of these villages are quite self-sustaining. I mean, there's very little globalization, very little mechanization, very little reliance on fossil fuels. This is a very typical scene. These sorts of things were, just sort of not affected by, these sanctions. A lot of folks were totally unaware of them who I talked to out in rural areas. It's just like, oh, really? Well, what does that mean? The other thing is the industries in Burma are often, very, how can I say it, just sort of artisanal, I guess. Just shops where these are sandals, flip-flops being made, just everything done by hand. There's a cigar shop. And so a lot of the economic activity in the country is pretty much insulated from these economic sanctions. Some enterprising businessmen took advantage of the absence of any American presence whatsoever, business presence, to sort of... I actually had a friend who I first met in 1994 in Burma, and he was a young man, penniless. He's now a multi-millionaire in U.S. dollars, and so he's one person who actually benefited from the sanctions because he got the idea, I'm going to contact foreign countries and trademark all of these things like the golden arches and so forth, and he's trained in law, and he just billed foreign companies at normal foreign company rates, like $10,000, $20,000 US dollars, which they were happy to pay to be registered legally, and the trademark registered in the country, and he just making money hand over fist. He did that with Walmart. Here's the downtown Walmart, which has nothing to do with our Walmart. But anyway, so so this is going on to 2007. Then there was another popular revolution, the so-called Saffron Revolution. The Buddhist monks took to the streets, protesting, again, the economic mismanagement, and this was brutally crushed, and as you can imagine, even further sanctions, anything that was left to do in terms of sanctions against Burma was done by the U.S. government. However, this Saffron Revolution sort of precipitated a change over the course of about 3 years. And so what happened is in 2010, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest, and the country began sort of opening up. And, this really unbelievable scenes for me, Hillary Clinton meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi in the house where she was under house arrest for 20 years. She was able to run for Parliament in 2012 and won. And then you can imagine at this point this was seen by the U.S. as, this great transition to democracy, which it has been in some ways. But anyway, this flood of photo ops of American politicians going to Burma now and see democracy won out, our sanctions saved the day, and all this kind of stuff, which I would argue strongly with, but nonetheless, those were the big changes. President Obama, culminating with President Obama traveling to Burma, first sitting president ever to go to Burma, meeting Aung San Suu Kyi at her house, getting a little bit friendly, I think. Came across that picture about 3 a.m. this morning, and I was like, what's going on? But anyway, so these sanctions in the last several years have been gradually loosened. So it's sort of a reversal of the gradual strengthening, the gradual loosening of the U.S. sanctions, which most Burmese people I know see as a very positive step. In 2015, there were the first elections in Burma. Aung San Suu Kyi's party won, and she's constitutionally prohibited from being president, but she's essentially the de facto president of the country now. but still has quite limited powers because the military has reserved a lot of the power for themselves. So it's a strange sort of an uneasy civilian military dance right now, I guess you could say, in the political situation. And so now, as the sanctions have been lifted, the very first U.S. franchises have appeared on the streets of the capital. I was just there last summer, and again, my jaw dropped. Wow, I never would have thought I'd see KFC in downtown. Okay, but anyway, just so a couple of points. However, unfortunately, things are reversing a little bit. Just 2 months ago, new sanctions were announced against Burma because of the Rohingya crisis, the huge humanitarian crisis in western Burma, where 680,000 ethnic minority Rohingya have been displaced from their homes, their villages have been burned. It's a long story that I don't have time to get into, but this is, a horrible humanitarian crisis. So now the sanction pendulum is swinging back a little bit more, although these are much more targeted sanctions that were announced in December, targeted against particular military generals who the U.S. felt was behind this sort of ethnic cleansing going on in the country. Threw that in just to make the end. Everybody always is talking, everybody thinks I'm a CIA agent, and they're always I was like, no, that's the CIA agent. That's the guy. He's got the shirt on. Okay, but that's just kind of a brief overview, and I don't want to take up much time, but just sort of the last sort of points. The sanctions, I don't think, worked per se because the Burmese economy wasn't one that lent itself that well to that sort of economic pressure. On the other hand, I would say that there were some sort of perhaps unintended secondary effects. I know that the sanctions, particularly amongst young people I know in Burma, caused increasing dissatisfaction with the government, which was already pretty strong, but young people did not want to live their lives isolated from the international community like their parents and grandparents had. The U.S. basically having no presence in Burma, and the U.S. with its power of global media reach and so forth, it was seen by young Burmese people as yet another sign that their government was absolutely illegitimate, which arguably contributed to the 2007 revolution, which was a real sort of turning point towards an opening of the country. So, yeah. I think I'm about out of time, but that's about all I had to say. So I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O, for your introduction, and also thank you, Dr. Thomas, for your presentation on Burma slash Myanmar, I guess. So it's a privilege to speak to the audience today on a very important subject, the U.S. engagement with one of the most important continents in the current world economy. Asia as a continent is home to 2/3 of the world's population. It is home to two of the most populous countries in the world, China and India. It is also responsible for 1/3 of the world economy. The continent's influence manifests in various facets of our lives. As a producer and trader of relatively simple technologies, such as paper and pens, to more sophisticated technologies, such as our mobile phones and computers. In other words, it's a continent that might be physically far away in terms of distance. However, there is little separation when viewed in terms of the composition of goods produced out of the continent that sustains our habits and our means of productivity. Given the importance of the region to U.S. residents, it leads us to ask a simple question of how the U.S. is engaging with the member countries of this continent, and whether the dynamic mechanics of these engagements will have cascading effects on our daily lives. Despite the elegance of the questions, the search for answers is rather complicated, as Dr. Thomas has shown. It is rather complicated also due to a multitude of moving parts involved. This presentation will outline some of those key components. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, the audience will have a better understanding of the events unfolding in the US and the Asian continent that will enable individuals to reach their own conclusions of whether Asia is a partner and or competitor. This presentation is organized as follows. First, we will cover some changes in UN foreign policy that impacts US relations with the Asian continent. This is relevant as changes outlined by the current administration alters the paradigm in which strategies are formulated. More simply, it sets the boundaries on what is permissible in terms of options and approaches when engaging the various countries in the continent. Second, we will briefly cover changes occurring in the region. Given the diversity of the continent, we will focus on the major intra-continent movements. This is relevant as it highlights changes with potential implications to U.S. engagement in the region, yet where the U.S. has little or no influence in altering its outcomes. Lastly, we will combine the first and second topics to start exploring what the combination means. Once we start to piece together the two topics, we can then start to answer some of the more approachable questions, such as, does any of this matter? Do I need to be interested? Will it impact me and my community? Etc. With this discussion, we'll be able to close the full circle by returning to the question on whether they are partners and or competitors. Okay? So one of the two things that's very important that happened during this current administration was first withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership on January 23rd, 2017. So this is basically where the U.S. said that we are not going to partake on this partnership that is shared by, most particularly Japan, led by Japan, and the Pacific Rim countries. This was kind of interesting because it was really to counterbalance the growing influence of China's economy. So that's one thing that happened. And second is the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords on June 1st, 2017. So President Donald Trump thinks he wants to not partake in it, which is interesting since the U.S. Insurance industry is heavily reliant on these changes, as we saw in Florida and Texas and etc. So what's the impact of the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnerships on earlier last year? Well, one of the important things that's why it's relevant is because East Asia and the Pacific is responsible for 29.6% of the world economic output. Right? So currently, if you look at the global economic output, it's around 75 trillion. Where East Asia and the Pacific is around 22.5. Now, China itself is responsible for 14% of the economic output, so pretty significant. And it's growing. Now, so it's really important to understand, kind of give this background, because now this is an approach of disengagement, right? So you're basically saying, okay, we don't want that. We don't want to have any part of it. You guys figure it out, etc. But once again, when you have these policies, it also has irreversible consequences. And we'll cover some of that and the reasons why they're irreversible. The second part is with regards to Paris climate change. Although President Donald Trump has withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, however, we have to understand that the president doesn't dictate everything, and so there's a network of megacities, which is the C40 megacities, that get together, and these are the mayors of major cities that dictate and say that we're still on board with climate change actions. And this is relevant because as the C40 countries, majority of the cities, majority of the city growth is actually going to be seen in Asia in the future. So if you look at kind of, I guess, the biggest cities in the world, there's a significant portion is actually of Asian countries, especially China and India, of course, because China has more than 1 billion people, So that's India. Idaho state population is 1.7 million, so you can kind of see. And a lot of these megacities actually have a bigger population than the entire state of Idaho. So, put things into perspective. Also, it's responsible for the cities themselves, which is a global network, is responsible for 25% of the world economy. So, and as you know, urbanization is continuously happening. Urbanization is oftentimes a byproduct of industrial growth and modern countries' modernization process. So we will continue to see growth in these areas, whether U.S. engages or not. That's kind of the reality. Okay. So if you look at the dots here, the blue dots indicate the mega cities, and these are the cities that will continuously grow. And as you see, most of them are capitals. Of course, then one of the kind of the big growth that we will see is in India and also in China. Now, Asia itself, without kind of separating away from the U.S., has its own internal growth. Okay, so that's kind of I guess the most important part of the fact that we have to pay attention to. The continent itself is responsible for 1/3 of the world economy, but it is also continuously growing. It is actually predicted to be the fastest growing continent in the world. So IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, predicts that in 2017 they will have 5% growth, and in 2000 this year they will have 5.4. U.S. economic growth is 2.3. So as you can kind of do some simple math, you'll see if this pattern continues, we'll see Asia's economic influence growing. Okay, so very relevant. Also, as everyone knows, the rise of China is very significant, and we'll see this a little more in depth, is because, as Dr. Thomas has mentioned, China's influence is growing everywhere in Asia. And a vacuum of U.S. presence is not really helping that situation as well. So here's Japan's export destination. So if you look at Japanese export products, as you can see, the red is all those countries in Asia. So although people talk about, U.S.-Japan alliance, that's great, yeah. But as you look at kind of Japan's an export-oriented growth country, but more than half of it is actually exported to Asia. Okay, and this pattern continues. Okay, so U.S. occupies only 22% of its exports. Same for South Korea. So South Korea, very strategic U.S. alliance, ally in the region. China has surpassed U.S. in terms of export destination. This makes a lot of things complicated if you're interested in North Korea in terms of leverage, right? So given South Korea has experiences where South Korea kind of South Korea installed a THAAD defense system, which is terminal high altitude defense system because North Korea was shooting at missiles. China boycotted. China issued a national boycott on tourism for South Korea. So it had economic repercussions. And because China didn't want to have the THAAD missile system, defense system, installed in the country because the radar can actually see into China. So, look at Thailand. So here's some other examples as well too. Thailand, as you can see, is kind of in terms of Southeast Asia, one of the bigger players. More than half of it is actually exports to Asia. Okay. So U.S. only accounts for 12% of its exports. Continuing, India. India is kind of unusual because India doesn't export a lot to China. However, if you look at the composition, they're also, because they see China as a rival within the continent. However, they, as you can see, significant portion, close to half, is destinations to Asia. However, what's more interesting about India is the largest import origin is actually China. So 18% of all its imports actually originate from China, which is, as you can see, if you export a lot and if you're dependent on those goods, you create a reliance. Pakistan, look at Pakistan imports similarly. 30% of all goods imported to Pakistan is from China. US only 4.4, which makes a lot of leverage very difficult, right? Especially if, and also once again, like if you want to do economic sanctions don't really work if you have a very small portion. If you contribute a very small portion to that country's economy. So I guess Dr. Thomas has mentioned, like the rural economy, they're not relying mostly on imports. So it's very difficult to impose sanctions to change political behaviors because it simply doesn't really matter. So the reason I showed you this is because it kind of shows that disengagement does not necessarily mean that these Asian economies will fail. I think we have to wake up to the realization that the Asian economy is dynamic, it's constantly evolving, and it's the fastest growth region in the world. So turning a blind eye doesn't necessarily solve the problem. That's really kind of the big issue. Now, as you can see, like China's export destination, there's a lot of China people oftentimes mention that China's growing influence in the U.S. market. Yes, but as you can see, China only exports 20% of its products, less than 20% of its products to the U.S. Right? So, in the absence of any economic sanctions or any absence, it's basically if those things don't go there, they're going to go to other countries. Right? That's simple reality. Business people still have to make money. They still have to pay employees. They have to pay for resources. So that's a big problem, right? So it's a big problem because if you combine, if you think about it, do you want to be in the back seat of the car or do you want to be in the front seat of the car? That's pretty much how you think about it. Because the world is still evolving, even as we speak right now. So when combined, what's next when you look at current U.S. administration's position and also kind of realizing the dynamic interaction, dynamic growth and evolutions of the continent. Well, vacated seats are being filled with inter-region leadership roles, and these are irreversible changes as inter-region trade continues to grow. A very good example is, for example, like Cambodia. Cambodia is it's kind of next to, actually, so Cambodia is in that Southeast Asia region. It's right next to Thailand. What's really interesting about Cambodia is the fact that it has it has corrupt leader, Hun Sen, Prime Minister Hun Sen, because he's a dictator, and basically they're having elections. However, he of course it's not free elections because he arrests and charges people who are running in opposition to him. Now the problem is oftentimes, so before kind of with the growing influence of as Cambodia's economy is growing and it also had to rely on aid from the U.S. and European countries, humanitarian or a certain degree kind of addressed in terms of heard would be the better word. However, those things are changing because recently Xi Jinping, the president of China, went to Cambodia and offered to give the country $600 million. Now, of course, these are unconditional, right? So less conditional. It doesn't have human rights issues. And then, of course, Japan also wants to grow its influence in the region. So Japan's also a wealthy country. So it pledges $270 million in aid. So with the kind of close to $1 billion in aid that's given to the country, doesn't really have much ties to humanitarian issues, the dictator will continue to thrive. Right. So it also alters a lot of things. So, and of course, when the U.S. says, "Oh, we have these human rights concerns," and of course, in sense like, "Yes, but I have $1 billion this time. I can live the other way." And of course, combine that with liberal economic ties in terms of export-import orientations, then you kind of see why certain policies are ineffective. Okay. So lastly, as I conclude, so what's the implications to the U.S. When you combine these two? Well, the continuing economic dependence with limited options for intervention and agenda-setting authorities. So, so one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight is that U.S. competitiveness is a product of the world economy economic system, which is constantly changing. So it's not, it's not the U.S. can suddenly remove from the world economy and the world economic production. And this is very clear. I mean, look at your cell phones, made from China. Look at your laptops. Look at your clothes, mostly in South Asia. So basically, a lot of things that U.S. citizens here rely on is basically produced elsewhere. And if you have sanctions and the trade stops, what do you think will happen? Almost overnight, prices will jump, right? Think about, everyone drives a car, right? Is there rubber, think about if you had to drive without tires. Because rubber trees or rubber plantations are in Southeast Asia, right? And Thailand and Malaysia. It's not here, so it's not in the U.S. So, and similarly, like, okay, if you had to shut down oil, right? What do you think will happen? Of course, oil prices go up, and when oil prices go, what happens? Everything goes up. So now, so one of the things I think wanted to highlight is that although U.S. is still a superpower, it only, I guess I would not say only, but it's responsible for 1/4 of the world's economic output. I think that's kind of what we need to wake up to. It's basically, it's not 60%, it's not 70%, it's not 80%, it's 25%. Right? That has a whole different meaning, especially when everyone's livelihoods are dependent on this international trade system. Okay, thank you. And so I guess in terms of the last thing, partners and competitors, I think it's open to judgment, and so I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Professor Thomas and Professor Wu for a very informative presentation. My role is a discussant, so I will make some quick remarks and then ask some questions to warm the audience up, and then you guys can start to join in, make your observation, and maybe ask questions. I don't know where this quote comes from. I think I myself first heard it when I watched the movie Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner. I think in the movie it says, if you build it, they will come. They will come. So does that apply to trade policy? So sometimes governments think, if we do this, if we set a mind on it, we build the roads to the capital, the current capital of Myanmar. You might recall in one of Dr. Thomas' pictures of the new capital, there was one guy standing in a 4-lane highway. Or they say they want to develop tourism. That's what the government wanted to do. But after they build the roads, do the tourists come? Like in Field of Dreams. So that is give us a lesson on so-called strategic trade policy. Strategic trade policy is the government identify some strategic area to invest in, to develop port resources, and then say, we will be able to leverage that advantage in the future. The question is, if it's not homegrown, if it's not organic, but dictated by a government, it's unlikely to be successful. when Hillary Clinton visited the capital of Vienna. They had hotels there and they held business conferences. Great opportunity for US business, European business. So firms went there to attend a conference, but what I recall is very few followed up. So this is just one observation about government strategic trade policy and whether it is successful. Another observation is, I think Professor Thomas Friend today is making even more money. First, he started to register trademarks for KFC and McDonald's. And after the government opens up, and McDonald's and KFC started to operate in Myanmar, he will have another business to enforce the property right for these companies. Go tell this little store using the Walmart name, no, you cannot do it. So he's going to collect money from Walmart for enforcing the trademark.
Absolutely. He's predominantly wealthy. He's also in the parliament too. So.
Oh. And protection of intellectual property is a very important trade issue. We have a panel this afternoon about trade and political economy. I guess we will have more time to talk about that this afternoon. A question about the isolation of Myanmar up until the 1990s. It was, the military started to crack down 1988. Now, before that, it was still the Cold War and there's China and Soviet Union. Did they decide to stay neutral, or they were
Yeah, they were pretty well non-aligned, although the government sort of experimented with a sort of socialism, I guess, a socialistic system, but they were sort of non-aligned in the Cold War.
Were there any Maoist guerrilla?
No.
Interesting.
Yeah, the U.S. continued sending like USAID and so forth. I think just because it was a convenient place to have some influence in that region. Most of U.S. influence was in Thailand, of course, but they just kept it in limbo there.
Talking about Thailand, you mentioned Myanmar grows a whole lot of poppy. And produce opium. Now they produce it, they need to sell it out in order to earn money. So who distributes the drug for them?
Mostly the heroin. Some of the ethnic groups have labs where they actually process it into finished heroin, but it mostly goes through China and Hong Kong and also Thailand.
And trade in these illegal drugs or other illegal substances is a big important issue. We have sanctions against Myanmar wanted to accomplish something, but they have an alternative revenue source.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I agree with Dr. Wu's assessment that Asia, the economy is growing, and if you look at 5% versus 2.3% in the US, so 2.3 or 2.6, high 2, I think. For the US, 2.6 is a pretty good growth rate. Years before that, we were averaging 1, less than 2. So of course, 2 point something from our perspective it is good record. But for a region, a country growing at 5%, it will take them 15 years to double in size. 15 years to double in size. The U.S. growing at, let's say, I bump it up to 3%. It will take the U.S. 24 years to double in size. So it's not surprising if we measure the size of the economy not by the current dollar amount. The World Bank published reports on the size of the economy using current dollar. The U.S. is still the #1 economy. Another international organization, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, measure the size of the economy by how much a dollar can buy, not just the dollar figure. And they call that purchasing power. And according to IMF number, a year and a half ago, China overtook the U.S. as the #1 economy in the world. So okay, I agree with Dr. Wu's overall theme for the importance of Asia.
Yeah, so can I comment on that? So I think, yes, definitely in terms of 2.3, so U.S. GDP or global economic output itself is currently the largest. I think the most concerning, for a lot of people is the fact that economic growth has multiple factors. So even within the U.S., when we talk about economic growth is not spread evenly within the U.S. Right, so this is very clearly in terms of the California case versus other rural communities. And one of the things that we find out is the fact that a lot of the economic growth happens in collaborations and when you have multiple people and when the market actually encourages such creativity and innovations. In that sense, population has a huge factor, right? And one thing that is, I think, scary for a lot of people is the fact that, or should be on people's radar, is the fact that Asia has 2/3 of the world's population. So if you're like in China, and the reason why China is so important and also India is such a hot topic is that their population is 1 billion people. So if you sell $1 to each person, you're already a billionaire, right? And you think like, oh, it's like $1 is not that big. Yeah, but yeah, if you sell 1 billion of them, you're already like. So the concern is the fact that these economies are also growing. These economies are growing, and people are having greater wealth, disposable income, that supports very creative industries. And that's what's kind of concerning because competitiveness is a combination of both being able to produce very good quality stuff at the lowest cost, but also in terms of pioneering industries and new technologies. So the reason why also climate change and pulling out of the Paris Accord is so concerning is the fact that even the energy industry is shifting, right? Our traditional, unfortunately, traditional energy plants is being replaced by more green infrastructure. Now, certain countries like China and South Korea and other Asian countries are investing heavily on these green industries. And by the fact that you pull out from it, it doesn't mean basically you're not investing in scientists, you're not investing in engineers, you're not creating a certain environment for that growth to take place. And so that is the concern. It's basically, yes, that region is also growing very rapidly, but the big question is, in 5 years' time, 20 years' time, is this going to shift, right? And then, and the big concern is that if it shifts, and if it shifts significantly, it might be too late to do anything.
I guess our audience your positions, questions. So okay, let's open up to questions and comments.
When you have, one of the things about China and India as Southeast Asia as a whole, I don't know who I want to address this question to, but as the people within those economies become more affluent, their demand for in-house goods also increases. So their internal economies begin to grow. And I know that right now China's at like 5%. And I'm assuming that is mostly what's going outside the country rather than inside the country. Because as the internal demand increases, what happens to the external exports?
So your question, when I showed the diagrams, one of the things is that export is actually a relatively, it doesn't rule the entire economy. Right, so basically you export because you export thinking that when you export you can actually make more money than selling it domestically. Right, there has to be some more greater incentive, economic incentive for to do that. Now, in terms of domestic industries and promoting innovative, well, I would say look at Japan. Right, Japan kind of was for a certain amount of time was pretty much strong power in Asia economically. What's really interesting about Japan, one kind of unique factor is that, look at restaurant industry, right? Restaurants tend to be very creative if you watch TV, and it's like a new thing right now. Japan has the most Michelin star restaurants in the world. So if you don't know what Michelin restaurants are, Michelin is basically, it's a tire company, right? So, massively rich. It's a French company, right? It's a French tire company, and it kind of goes to restaurants secretly and ranks, give them 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, based on how good their cuisine is and how innovative they are. Right? And it's relevant because French chefs commit suicide by losing a star. Right? There has been incident. Strangely, you kind of so the fact that Japan has the most Michelin stars in the world, it's the single most country. And it kind of also lends to the fact that when people start, when people are looking for areas to invest, and Japan was kind of a very good case because Japanese people save so much money that you actually have to pay a fee in order to actually put your money in the bank, right? So which is kind of counter intuitive, right? I leave my money in the bank and I hope that my interest will occur. Now, in Japan, at a certain period of time, if you have put money in the bank, you have to pay a fee. So, of course, then naturally you have to look for outward places where you can actually build on your savings, right? And so that's kind of a very good illustration. So if we also see that, and the fact that combination with that and the combination with, I think, a Berkeley professor who talks about, wrote a very good book called The New Geography of Jobs, and basically looking at job growth in the U.S. and its discrepancies and its variations. So one thing that you note is that, in megacities, typically you see a lot of U.S. growth there in terms of jobs. So it's better to be a waitress in a megacity because you'll actually get paid more. So given the combination of those two and kind of thinking creatively and thinking about what happens when these countries start to invest significantly in their own economies, right? Then it's then what that means is that they're going to have their own engine of growth, right? And it's further going to dominate. Especially in one of the big concerns that I think China and India is the fact that once they get wealthy, they start hiring the best people. They hire the best people, the smartest people, the pioneering people, because if you're a business person, you move when you go with money. So the Google vice president moved, right? Because basically, to Alibaba and saying, I don't need to be in the U.S. because I see greater potential in China's growth because basically there's so many people there. So businesses will move, right? That's one of the key concerns is the fact that when you start to have a brain drain, then what happens? So,
how does that tie in with the sort of general anti-intellectual sentiment that Americans have? We certainly don't value, college educations here in this country. We don't value the intellectual tradition that we see in, say, Europe, or I see developing in China and in India.
Yeah, but I think one of the great things still here is the fact that people, scientists and intellectuals still prefer to be here. And because there is, when you look at kind of, although society in the general society might not, but the fact is that if you look at social regulations and economic regulations and promoting of sciences through those organizations and providing a kind of a nurturing environment for scientists to be creative, be innovative, I think that is still driving. So if you, one of the kind of the strength is that universities in the U.S. are by far creative, and I guess in terms of supporting the professors and faculty. However, how long that will be, it's unclear. Like Singapore, for example, has a GDP of $90,000 per capita, and Singapore is very active in recruiting U.S. educated professors because they believe that they're a small country, and they believe that bringing professors in also will create that environment to be creative. So they have, so their country is very interesting because it's only 0.3% the size of Idaho. However, it has one of the leading pharmaceutical companies, industries in the world, also in water technology, etc. So.
If I could jump in just for a second, Dr. Wu, you know, the issue of China's influence and the U.S. disengaging from, you know, it's I think there's another interesting angle to it. It's not just that China can give lots of money to countries like Myanmar or Cambodia, because what happened in Myanmar was when the Obama administration in 2009 sort of did their Asian pivot, you know, we're going to really pay attention to it was really well received in Myanmar because an angle that I think is sometimes overlooked is there's a lot of anti-China sentiment in a lot of smaller countries in the region. Burmese people always, you know, talk about the domination of China and what China wants, China gets, and we're sort of a colony of China, and you know, that sort of thing. And so there was a strong, one of the drivers of the opening up of Myanmar was to be able to engage with Europe and to leverage an engagement with Europe and America vis-a-vis China, rather than just being overrun and dominated by China. And so that creates a lot of opportunities, and that opportunity was sort of there. And so, you know, getting back to your point, so if the U.S. now, I mean, with it putting sanctions, whether right or wrong, I mean, that's a complex issue, but now putting sanctions back on Burma, disengaging from the region, it's, you know, really kind of a lost opportunity, I think, because a lot of those smaller countries, like say Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, you know, they would like an alternative to China's hegemony, you know.
So, and just to build upon that, I think that's a very good point, and I think that is very highlighted in kind of the Vietnam case. Vietnam, historically, you know, China invaded Vietnam a lot, so Vietnamese people don't like China. So they're also, given that China is also growing influence in the South China Sea area. However, what's really interesting is the fact that you can't deny that China is still playing that game. Right? China is actively engaging with these countries and playing that game in terms of trying to, like, you know, Vietnam is pushing back, but it's also China's reaching out to other surrounding countries to kind of, I guess, abate and mitigate Vietnam's vocal pushback on China's money and influence. That's so the thing is, so I think you're definitely spot on, I think, in terms of there is an element because there is also alternative motives. One of the reasons why China engages in a lot of these countries is also to secure their resource line and resource trade, because China also, because as they're growing, they're also reliant on resources that's outside of the country. So that's the One Belt and One Road policy that they're initiating. But you see, I think what's really interesting is, like, you know, for like Myanmar's case is they, you know, China's reaching out to, you know, offering, of course, Myanmar's and, you know, offering to help with the Rohingya situation, and Myanmar's like saying, no, I don't need you. So, but then also, but what's also concerning is the fact that, yes, I guess my understanding of Myanmar is that, you know, the U.S. ambassador just left Myanmar. So that's another kind of concern as well too. So I guess, you know, I mean, there's no perfect, I guess, magic bullet, but the fact is, you still got to play that game in order to win it. That's how I see that. So.
More questions? Comments?
Hello, good morning. My name is Chantal Oudrad from Women in International Security. I have just two comments and maybe then ask for a reaction from the panelists. First, in terms of the sanctions on Burma were, of course, unilateral sanctions. And we know from sanction research that unilateral sanctions don't work very well. Multilateral sanctions are way more effective, but of course none of the countries in the region really wanted to engage on this sanctions policy. And so, there's no surprise that these sanctions weren't really working. The question is, are the sanctions now that we're talking about in terms of the Rohingya crisis, are they able to maybe gather more multilateral support, and what would be the consequences of that? Then the other issue in terms of if we look at the region more generally, there is the economic story, but then there's of course also the security story. And there is the story about South China Sea, where there's all kind of contestations about the islands, etc. Lots of pushback or lots of activity by the Chinese, which is very well received by the countries in the region. And then the other big question is, of course, North Korea and the possibility, I think, a real possibility of war there. And so the story on the security side, I think a lot of countries in the region still look very much to the U.S. in terms of security guarantees. So I'd like to get your comments on that.
Well, with the first issue of the new sanctions on Myanmar, I actually don't know. I haven't heard anything through the grapevine that it's going to take on a more multilateral approach. It's kind of a small baby step right now. Basically, the U.S. government sanctioned a general in particular, a Burmese general, not the country as a whole. And froze any assets in the U.S. and prohibited travel for him and his family to the U.S. and things of this nature. So, yeah, I'm not sure how that will play out. Certainly the Rohingya crisis is getting a lot of international attention, obviously, and has been for many months now. Other than Syria, most people are considering it the worst sort of ongoing humanitarian crisis in the world. So I guess we'll see. But I absolutely agree with you about the unilateral versus multilateral business with the sanctions. And to kind of connect with what Dr. Ru said, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, tried to talk the U.S. out of the really hardcore 1997 sanctions against Myanmar, because ASEAN said, well, we have to live with this country in our midst, and our thinking is engaging it and keeping lines of communication open rather than just shutting it off, especially a country that had been isolated for decades anyway, so it's not, it's sort of like, oh, wow, something new here, ASEAN's position was one of engagement. The U.S. for, the old cliche is all foreign policy is actually domestic policy, right? It seems like, in some ways, I would say that the sanctions against Burma were intended more as a proxy. Burmese people complained to me many times that the reason their government is getting sanctioned for the same sorts of things that the Chinese government often does, but of course the U.S. is not going to mess with China, but Burma is a convenient small player that we can say, look, we stand for human rights in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I think ASEAN had a more constructive idea towards dealing with Myanmar, I felt. But, I guess that's all I have about that.
On the sanction question, could I toss it back to our expert on women and security? Suu Kyi Aung San did not come to this year's or last year's UN General Assembly meeting. Now, she's in a very delicate situation. She's the, may I say, nominal leader of the country, but the military is under control. If I'm not mistaken, 40% of the seats of the parliament is allocated to the military. So, in order to keep what she has already won, I guess she has to not take too strong a stand on what the military is doing to the Rohingyas, or it could be a reflection of the general Buddhist population's view towards the Muslim Rohingyas. So if she can take a more stronger stand, do you think there will be more countries joining in a multilateral sector to make it more effective? So I'm tossing that question back to you.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a very difficult question, and everybody is tap dancing a little bit around it. I think a lot of people have been disappointed by a not stronger stance, a human rights stance from Aung San Suu Kyi. And she has always, she's been quite public and saying, well, it's not that big of a deal, etc. So, you know, we understand that she has reasons not to want to be too much out front. But I think a lot of people have also been very disappointed. And so the question becomes, is she also not maybe part of that Buddhist nationalist establishment? And, you know, has brought into part of that. I'm not a Myanmar specialist.
So can I actually, so it's really interesting since we just covered Myanmar in our Government and Politics of Asia class. So Myanmar situation is very interesting because Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't really have a formal, she's a state counselor, right? So she, by law, by constitution, cannot run for presidency, and so she has a deputy in place. However, she did comment that I will rule above the president. But what's really interesting about Myanmar's situation and why people kind of try to understand why is she still being so complacent. The reason is because the military has 25% automatically guaranteed seats in both upper and lower. And they also are responsible for appointing the security apparatus in the country. So the military is their appointee, and so basically Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't really have, even though she's a political party that's in power, is very wary about pushing the envelope. And the reason for that is, and kind of the best guess in terms of why she's so cautious is because when you look at Thailand, its neighbor. So if you haven't followed up with Thailand's situation, is Thailand has a military coup. So the democracy is basically suspended because the military has a position, and so basically the military is running the country. So one thing that political parties don't have, but military has, is the option of coup. And given that their neighbor has already suffered a coup, Aung San Suu Kyi is also going to be very cautious of pushing the military to give up. Also, and what's really interesting about Myanmar is the fact that it's a classic case in comparative politics as a failed state, in a sense that the central government does not have full control over all the regions, all the areas. So there's military separate groups, Dr. Thomas has mentioned, in terms of Rohingya, but there's also Shan, there's also Mon. So there's the fringes, the areas in the fringes, or the province of the fringes, are run by militant groups, which also is very problematic. So when you start when you're conceding to one area, the big question is politically, how much do you concede to other areas as well?
Yeah, if I could add just a couple observations, because I asked a lot of people about these issues in Burma this past summer when I was there, and first of all, exactly, Aung San Suu Kyi, first of all, she's the de facto president. Secondly, the military actually wrote the constitution that the country is run under now, and they wrote themselves position of power. Aung San Suu Kyi is not a commander-in-chief in the sort of U.S. presidential sense. defense, border, security, military, police, all of that's not her jurisdiction. So it's, it's a very civilian side of the government that takes care of civilian stuff, and the military still has the sort of heavy-handed responsibility. You mentioned the religious dynamic too, which is frankly surprising for me. I have very close friendships going back over 20 years with many wonderful folks who I love in Burma, and a number of them side with push the Rohingya out of the country. They said, no, they're not really Burmese, they're Bangladeshi and they don't belong here. And these are really nice, compassionate Buddhists. And I was like, really? You're saying this? So there's a strong sense of that outsider status for the Rohingya, even amongst very well-meaning, very great people, Burmese citizens, So I think Aung San Suu Kyi is aware of that too. There's a sort of Buddhist nationalism in the country. And then finally, just again, as Dr. Lee said, everybody told me last summer in Burma too, the military tomorrow could be back, it could be 2010 again tomorrow. They still control vast assets. All of the major businesses are tied in with the military, and this has been established for decades. You're not just going to disentangle it. And they constitutionally have the power of declaring national emergency, martial law. They control security forces. So, she's Aung San Suu Kyi. Not to be an apologist for her, I've also been disappointed in her stance with this, but she's really in a difficult position, I think, really between a rock and a hard place.
So I just wanted to add two comments. I think in terms of the potential military coup, I don't think that the situation in Thailand is as relevant because Thailand has had military rule for most of its history, and the democratic period was really an exception to the rule. And Burma has a military history that by itself is enough to caution people of how much they can lean out of the window. And the other side is ASEAN, where ASEAN has a really strong principle of non-interference in domestic affairs. So whereas the European Union has no issue and no problem meddling into other people's affairs, which is a good thing most of the time. And which has used the power oftentimes to get everyone back in line or make their disagreement known. When Haider became elected in Austria, they gave a slap on Austria's hand saying, no neo-Nazis. That has changed a little bit since then. So I think the institutional background, political culture is just very unfavorable in Southeast Asia in general to address Myanmar, and it ranks very low for the UN or the world agenda because there are no great power interests at stake. No one cares about Myanmar, unfortunately. So I think from all the world conflict, it has a very low priority and minor domestic incentives to do anything.
Well, I think the potential of Myanmar to grow is undoubted. I think that's kind of the reason. And the reason for that is the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, a lot of infrastructure development banks are actively engaging in Myanmar. And that's one of the reasons is because basically when they came out of their recluse, they were entitled to a lot of credit lines in terms of building infrastructure. So if one of the things probably you'll see a lot of Japanese companies there, a lot of Korean companies as well too. So a lot of this is also piggybacking on a lot of infrastructure loans that's actually being flown into the country. I think strategically in terms of level of development, it's pretty, slow and pretty low. However, the potential in terms of resources is significant. They do produce oil, so which is a significant part and contribute to the Myanmar's. And of course, they naturally eat very much as well too. So.
If I could bring up a more broader area, I think I'm interested in government. I support government, but I think the old model of nation states is more and more under attack because of the importance of ethnic and religious membership because of the flight of capitalism, information and technology. We're looking at net neutrality, copyright on inventions and things. So I'm thinking that the future after people like me will have a different, maybe a world organization which is really frightening to a lot of Americans because we're only 5% of the population. We wouldn't have a lot of votes in a representative world government. So when you talk about the issue of nations,
So I guess you're trying to allude to the fact that the global economy is further integrating, and also its transaction cost across borders is also further reduced by development of ICT, information communication technology. Is that kind of my...
yes.
Okay. So a lot of countries still, yes, ICT is definitely a force to reckon to. I think Thomas Friedman writes extensively on that issue. I think, but another thing what's really interesting is the fact that certain countries still have ICT infrastructure, right? So ICT infrastructure and voting is still far away. I mean, a very good example is going back to Myanmar. And it's like elections did happen, but it didn't happen all across the country. There were 600 villages that were not, where elections were postponed. Because of conflict. So despite, oftentimes when we take a U.S.-centric position, we think the world is safe and the world is convenient. A lot of countries still, I mean, I do a lot of water infrastructure and safe drinking water and toilets, and 2 billion people don't have access to personal toilets. Right, given the world economy, like the world is like 7 billion people, 2 billion don't have. We currently have more cell phones than toilets. So, and of course 600 million people don't have safe drinking water, access to safe drinking water. So a lot of these conveniences that we think is like, oh, you know, we turn on the switch, the light's going to be there, turn on the faucet, clean water's going to come down, you know, because a lot of these countries, even though ICT might make our lives convenient, it's based on a platform of a lot of other social regulations and development. So U.S. had that history where a lot of social regulation established a platform where people don't have to worry about, you don't have to worry about where safe drinking water comes. You don't have to worry about whether your electrical systems are going to be compatible.
Unless you live in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many standards that's also issued in the U.S. as well too, in terms of where, like if you go to Home Depot, you can kind of see various standards that's imposed not only in consumer market but also in terms of firm production as well too. So we kind of tend to overlook those things. But a lot of these countries, even though they might have money involved, they still don't have those foundations. So I guess ICT. Yes, it should be a concern, but I think there's still a gap in terms of where we envision other developing countries utilizing and harnessing those, services.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here because we are out of time. But please come back for our afternoon panel and our keynote speaker. The afternoon panel will be in the same room. The keynote, however, will be in Rendezvous in the planetarium.